Welcome to the third and final panel of the conference, which is titled Kennan and the Contemporary International Scene. So, still with an eye to history, of course, and to the life and legacy of George Kennan. We're going to look a little bit more to the present moment and perhaps even to the future in this panel and see how we can bring the conversations that we had this morning somewhat forward in time. We have 5 panelists. I'll sort of introduce them just by name. You have the biographies, the illustrious biographies printed out for you, and we'll start with David Engerman and work our way through the 5 panelists on the program. So David, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, first, a round of thanks to Michael and to Matt Rojansky and the Kennan Institute staff. And for those of you who've actually survived a full day, the last session is always a little bit dicier. And so congratulations to you on your endurance. Thinking about a Kennan for our times has a certain irony for me, because in some ways it's hard to imagine a Kennan for our own times when Kennan himself seems so uncomfortable in his own time. An exile in his own time, he once said, a man of the 18th century, and so on. But it's hard to say exactly where he would put in his own times, not least after we've had such excellent panels over the course of the morning that have covered much of what I was hoping to say. Nevertheless, we've been tasked to understand Kennan in our own times, and I'll try and take this on by making 3 points about lessons we might learn from Kennan in understanding the world today, drawing on and building on some of the comments we've heard earlier. There are many other lessons, of course. I'm going to stay away from American-Russian relations. We've heard much about that already. But the first point I want to raise is Kennan's skepticism about ideologies, which stood at the root of his own realist foreign relations, which I'll also say momentarily came with their own roots of his own training in Russia, in Weimar, about Russia, in Weimar-era Berlin. Second is Kennan's view of Russia as a part of Europe, would take it to be a part of the family of nations, also something he learned from his time in Berlin. And the third, not from Berlin, very American in its origins, I'd say, is his concerns never expressed in sort of a singular document, but appearing in a number of asides and smaller essays, his concern about environmental despoilation. He's hardly one to have predicted anthropogenic climate change, but I do want to note here that his concern for the environment is something, one lesson we could take from a Kennan for today. For the first 2 of these, about ideology and about Europe, I want to start with Kennan not as the Russia expert he became, but as the Russia expert his training to become Russia expert. He was sent by the State Department to learn about Russia, along with a very distinguished cohort. Along with that cohort, alone among that cohort, he opted to study Russia in Berlin. Others chose Paris. And when he arrived there in 1928, it was amid the intense ideological conflicts of the Weimar Republic. Indeed, ideology spilled more than occasionally into the streets in protests and armed gangs that animated, for instance, Arthur Koestler's accounts of his days in the Communist Party in Berlin in the 20s. His studies were quite remote from that at the Seminar für Osteuropäische Geschichte, Center for East European History, co-directed by 2 remarkable German scholars, both of whom focused on Russian history and Russian culture, not on Soviet ideology. One indication of his their own approach, his teacher's approach to history, that Stalin, one of his advisors, wrote about the Napoleonic invasion of Russia, but from the perspective of the imperial librarian in Moscow, not about war. It also happened that imperial librarian was a distant ancestor of his, which helped that, I'm sure. Kennan saw actually some courses at the seminar on Soviet ideology and politics and asked his boss back in Washington if he should take them. The reply came back from Washington: stick to history and culture, not politics. So what did Kennan learn from Berlin, and what can we in turn learn from that? Kennan learned, first of all, not to focus on ideologies, but on peoples and cultures. This is a point Anne-Marie Slaughter made earlier. To understand political and social systems in historical context, and of course, as a historian, there is no higher form of praise. He did this through deep immersion in culture, meaning for Kennan, high culture. He was particularly taken by the Silver Age of the fin de siècle. He contemplated writing a biography of Anton Chekhov. and it was immersed in the writings of late 19th and early 20th century Russian high culture. This in turn required knowledge of language, and it had language skills so strong that the Russian historians who I met on my first trips to Russia still remember decades later about how gifted he was in the Russian language. There are important lessons for today in this that I don't think I need to spell out here at the Kennan Institute. John Feiner, actually, in the second panel, already identified these a little bit. These comments, I'd say, are less directed toward geopolitics than to academic politics, but speak to the value of area studies in producing expertise and producing experts. It's facing constant challenge, this of regional expertise from external funders, even organizations like the Social Science Research Council, the Department of Education. All of these are focusing less on providing structure and instruction in cultures, in languages, in forms of area expertise. This, I think, makes the Kennan Institute all the more a treasure, even more so than it's ever been, functioning as both a center of and an advocate for local and regional knowledge. This was not just knowing about Russia, but knowing about all parts of the world, and an era that shows, I think, the willful neglect of building up such expertise. Indeed, I'd say an increasing skepticism about the nature of expertise. That we want to, I would want to recall this focus on really detailed, granular knowledge about societies and cultures that can only come through direct and real engagement in languages and taking history seriously. I think it's because of this experience and this knowledge that Kennan could describe the divergence between Russian culture and the Soviet Union that undergirded his vision of containment, as Anne-Marie Slaughter mentioned earlier. He could understand this because of his immersion in Russian culture, and he could understand, I think, the peregrinations of post-Soviet Russia because he had the linguistic and cultural tools, not to mention the general aptitude and inclination to understand the world through others' eyes. In this context, we can see his opposition to NATO expansion, for instance, already discussed, as rooted as much in his assessment of how this would appear from Russia. Right, how his deep-seated knowledge of Russian culture would allow him this kind of insight. I have a little bit of doubt that Kennan would have a similarly incisive understanding of contemporary post-Soviet Russia. This is something I started thinking about especially after Ambassador Teff's comments this morning, that Russia of Putin, Russian culture of Putin, is not Russia of the Silver Age. The turn of the 21st century turns out to be very little like the turn of the 20th, has elements of mass culture, superficiality, empty-headedness, licentiousness that Kennan looked upon with grave worry in looking at American mass culture of the 1950s and 1960s. A second aspect I think that George Kennan took from his studies in Berlin is, again, this focus on realities of foreign policy. The one time I actually had a direct encounter with Ambassador Kennan over a memorandum he had written in 1932, where I asked him what he learned in Berlin. His reply was he learned about the realia, not just of Russia, but of the world, the realities in a kind of more profound existential Germanic sense, I suppose, of geography, of economy, of culture. Kennan had a deep distrust of ideologies generally, of Soviet communism to be sure, but also of American liberalism. His Chicago lectures that became American diplomacy castigated decisions made on the basis of liberal ideas, the Wilsonian ideas that Matt Rojansky mentioned at the start of our day. And his somber assessments of American society did exhibit a skepticism about liberal optimism, an optimism summed up in the 1950s by the great U.S. historian Richard Hofstadter, who said that the United States was a society born to perfection and aspiring to improvement. Kennan would not, to be sure, be confused for an optimist in any of this. He was more readily drawn to reflection and self-doubt, but his concern about ideology, his skepticism there, reminds us to think about things outside of our own ideological blinders. In fact, I'd planned to mention this anyway, but the discussion at the end of the last panel about democracy promotion, I think, is an excellent example. That we should not take for granted that other countries will view things like democracy promotion as an unalloyed good. but instead that they would recognize it as as an unalloyed threat, which in fact I think is very much the case in Russia. That's not to say that the U.S. should not be promoting democracy promotion, but we just have to understand that it will not draw all sides in favor. Finally, just a few notes scattered in a sense, I guess, as Kennan's own views on this were, about the question of nature and conservation. Kennan's concerns about the despoilation of nature were most frequently framed in terms of his opposition to urban industrial society, his distaste for capitalist consumerism with its sort of tendency to immediate obsolescence, to the disposable society, and so on. He identified it primarily in the United States, although, of course, it existed elsewhere. And his concern was in large part about nature, in other words, was in large part for what it said about human society, less, in fact, about the risks that it posed to society, but more about what it said about humans, that they would destroy nature so readily. But irrespective of those origins, Kennan's urgent desire to call attention to the human impacts of the natural world would stand out as one area that Kennan might have found common cause with our times, perhaps even more, I would say, than he did with his own, this fragility of nature, about which he was reminded every weekend he went to the farm, without his email, as Matt reminded us. His concern was driven, again, not about climate change, but about how it reflected on humanity. But it does show one of the many ways in which the late 18th century, as well as the mid-20th century, can speak to our own time. Thank you.
David, thank you so much. And now let's turn to Susan Glasser.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much. And I think that was a great, looking back to Kennan in order to look forward to today. I am eager to hear what everyone else on the panel has to say, so I will keep myself brief. But I was struck in listening to you recount, some of the elements that informed Kennan's view of containment and his analysis of Soviet Russia, and how rooted they were in Russia itself, and his incredible knowledge and engagement with both the people and the culture, as you pointed out, as well as this distrust of ideology, and his brilliance as an analyst to anyone who's spent any time in Russia remains incredibly apparent today. That his ability to be ahead of the curve in the American foreign policy conversation really was grounded in a unique and exceptional knowledge of the challenge that he was attempting to describe. And so I think flash forward to the present day, and what I look at and I see as we try to understand where is American foreign policy going in this kind of confused and disrupted time. And I think we've sort of turned containment into a bipartisan ideology of American foreign policy without, in a way that sort of tears it away from its roots itself in the specific set of challenges of Russia in the mid-20th century and after World War II. And this is not a Trump phenomenon, although we can talk about how the ways in which that might become even more dangerous in the Trump and post-Trump era. But this is something I think that's been going on for really a significant period of time as new challenges have accreted in the post-Cold War era, and we have not necessarily come up with a new ideology to replace them. What I think has happened is that now, whether it's Iran, North Korea, China, resurgent Russia itself, we tend to pretty indiscriminately now apply the notion, or what we think is the notion, of containment to this new set of 21st century problems. In fact, right before I came over here, I was presiding at a containing Russia discussion at the Council on Foreign Relations. They've just put out a long paper filled with policies that I'm sure Donald Trump will rush to read on how we should counter this threat of a resurgent Russia. But again, it goes back much farther than that. A few years ago, when I was the editor of Foreign Policy magazine, I was thinking of that when I was thinking about preparing for this conference today. There's a terrific scholar who I'm sure many of you know, Kareem Sajapur, at the Carnegie Endowment, and he is an Iran expert. And he went through this exercise, and he took George Kennan's famous article, and he replaced all the references to Soviet Russia with references to Iran. And it's a very interesting, it holds up remarkably well in some ways. But again, I would say in some ways. And in some ways, of course, it's a ridiculously not helpful template in the sense that, the challenges faced by countering Iran and its use of Hezbollah in the post-Civil War Syria that's going to emerge. Again, I'm just not really sure that the sources of Soviet conduct is going to really be a useful guide and blueprint for us. There's also the fact that containment, as it has come to be understood in a popular, very reductionist way, has its own very specific political meaning, which then causes international actors as well as political actors here in the United States to respond to it in its own way. And I'll tell another story from the last few years that illustrates this. At the beginning of the Obama administration, remember the pivot to Asia? Remember that? I know it seems like a long time ago, but there was a moment when we were going to be leaving the conflicts of the post-Cold War era behind us, and Russia was an irrelevant non-entity, a regional player at best. The Middle East was a cesspool that President Obama, as you know, came into office determined to move away from. So we're going to pivot to Asia. Well, we published in Foreign Policy a manifesto of sorts by Secretary Hillary Clinton that used that phrase, somewhat controversially, I should say, inside the administration, where they immediately got a lot of pushback from advisors and allies in Europe and the like. But nonetheless, it was the Pivot to Asia article. And I say this by way of introduction. It didn't talk, by the way, that much about containment as a new strategy for dealing with China, although one could imply that to the extent it was not just about economic competition in Asia, but also about security competition and maintaining American leadership in the region. You could certainly infer from that article and from Secretary Clinton and President Obama's statements about Asia at that moment in time that was where they were headed with it potentially. And so, long preface way of saying this article took the interest of some higher up people in the Chinese government. I'm not quite sure who, and I'm certainly not by any means an expert on China or even well equipped to particularly understand the engagement that I subsequently had, but it feels worth recounting here. So I had met the previous year at the World Economic Forum a senior level Chinese official who had previously been based in the United States and had returned to Beijing and was a senior official in the foreign ministry. I had followed up with him after that encounter, never heard back. Well, he had kept my contacts, and right before I went back to the World Economic Forum, not long after publishing the Pivot to Asia article, I heard out of the blue from this very senior Chinese official who was very eager to set up a meeting with me in Davos. So I said, great, absolutely. Well, a sort of mysterious kind of low-level kind of, spy novel encounter. It occurred where, I was supposed to meet someone on a particular snowy corner, and he would, pick me up and take me in a van to some undisclosed location. Well, so I did that, thinking, well, this is pretty interesting. And sure enough, I had no idea really who was picking me up and where they were taking me, and they did not explain. I ended up in this very sort of large villa right on the ski slopes in Davos. It seemed to be a very nice kind of ski in and ski out kind of place. And this Chinese official was there, and he definitely wanted to talk about the pivot to Asia, but really the message he wanted to send to me, I wasn't sure who I was supposed to then pass this along to, but the message he wanted to send to me is, do not use this word. This word containment is terrible. And, we don't want to be contained. And we don't want you to ever use this word. So it's really interesting. It was not a nuanced, like, complicated scenario. It was really, this word has a specific meaning. It is about the Soviet Union, and it is not about China today, and that would be very unproductive. And so, again, I recount that for you because I see, flash forward, I guess not yet, maybe 6 or 7 years later, and rather than moving away from that, I think that in our foreign policy, at a moment of disruption and confusion and uncertainty about what it is that America stands for in the world anymore, what I see happening is a reversion to the norm and to old, comfortable forms of how we talk about security threats that we face in the world. And that is perhaps entirely understandable, right? We don't really know what... we have a palpable sense of this as a hinge point and a pivot point in our foreign policy and in our relationship to the rest of the world, and also in terms of our domestic politics and how what level of engagement with the world the American people are willing and able to support. And yet we don't have a leadership that is articulating a coherent and fully formed version of what that post-Cold War American ideology would be. And so what I see happening is a resurrection of a certain reductionist version of what we believe to be containment happening in our rhetoric, at least, about North Korea, about Iran, about almost any foreign policy threat that recurs. Russia is a good example. I think if you read the new national security strategy that was just released by the Trump administration, largely a product, as we understand it, of the National Security Advisor and his team at the NSC, what you see, again, is something that would be quite familiar to anybody who was writing in a way about American foreign policy in the late Cold War period and in the way that the challenges are framed. We can probably discuss at many other panel discussions whether that's a national security strategy that's actually supported by the president himself, but certainly it reflects what I would say is a consensus view of the team that he has assembled to advise him. And, to me, I think that I'm just very mindful of going back to the lessons of biography and history here, and to say that my guess is that Kennan himself would have hated that national security strategy and would have thought that we were in pretty big trouble in the world today. But I'll leave it at that, and thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And now staying with the G's, to James Goldgeier.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for the invitation. I appreciate the opportunity. Always thrilled when I can come back to the Wilson Center, where I spent some time in the mid-2000s. So, it's interesting thinking about the contemporary period. I mean, anytime we have a discussion about how to think about American grand strategy, George Kennan is the point of comparison, and it was it's been as true of the post-Cold War period as it was of the Cold War period. And the reason, of course, is that in the Cold War period, he got the big thing right. And as we've been talking about today, the notion that the United States needed to protect its core interests in Europe, Northeast Asia, and the Middle East. To do so, it needed to contain Soviet expansionism, particularly through non-military means of shoring up areas of U.S. interest. And there was discussion earlier today about the most spectacular example, which was the Marshall Plan for Western Europe, that he did so much to bring about. And his recognition that, given the rottenness of the Soviet system, and particularly the Stalinist system in place at the time that he wrote the X article, that if the United States could contain the USSR, the system would eventually collapse. And so, of course, in 1989, he looked like a genius for what he had written back in 1946 and 47. And as David points out, he got the big thing right for the right reasons. An extremely well-trained Foreign Service officer who knew the country, knew the culture, knew the language, and in fact, as has been referenced several times today, that he knew it better than he knew his own, which was a much bigger challenge. And I think, also important to note that he did get the big thing right, despite other features of his personality. And I think it's important to to mention those to give a full picture. One, the elitism, and this is someone who joined the Foreign Service in large part because it was a meritocracy and believed that foreign policy making was best left to Ivy League trained Northern European white diplomats, basically, and that, in fact, that the Soviet Union, because of its closed nature, had an advantage over the United States in the making of foreign policy, which turns out not to have been true. He was also a pessimist, which is quite an interesting feature of somebody who ended up forecasting the collapse of the Soviet Union. Like Henry Kissinger and like Paul Nitze, he had studied Oswald Spengler closely, Spengler's Decline of the West, which led him to believe that the West was, in fact, in decline. And unlike Nitze, who looked at ways in which the United States might be able to counter that decline, Kennan was more like Kissinger in focusing on managing it. He was not an optimist like Ronald Reagan, but ended up, of course, in the same place with respect to the prospects for the Soviet system. Getting the big thing right meant that it also would have been good to pay attention to him on other things, most notably Vietnam, which he understood was an unnecessary and undesirable misapplication of containment, a foreign policy and human disaster. And I just want to read a quote from his December 12th, 1965 piece for the Washington Post. And important, 1965 was long before others got on this position. But a piece for the Washington Post Outlook section that I think will cause you to reflect on a certain commitment that the United States maintains today. Quote, "I would not know what victory means if we can find nothing better to do than embark upon a further open-ended increase in the level of our commitment, simply because the alternatives seem humiliating and frustrating. One will have to ask whether we have not become enslaved to the dynamics of a single unmanageable situation, to the point where we have lost much of the power of initiative and control over our own policy, not just locally, but on a world scale." Now, he did get certain things wrong, one of which I think you might agree with, and one of which many of you probably won't agree with me that he got it wrong. But he said his greatest mistake, as was mentioned earlier today, was support for CIA covert operations, which he had seen as a non-military way of implementing containment. In my view, he did also get wrong NATO enlargement. As I said, I'm sure that many of you who would disagree with me on that. But I think it's important to point out on the NATO enlargement issue, this was not, when he wrote the fateful error in '97, this was not something that was new to him with respect to NATO and NATO enlargement. It didn't just emerge in the mid-1990s. He had not been a huge fan of NATO when it was created, and he certainly had been opposed to the idea of enlargement from the very beginning, worrying, quote, "beyond the Atlantic area, which is a clean-cut concept and which embraces a real community of defense interests rooted in geography and tradition. There's no logical stopping point in the development of a system of anti-Russian alliances until that system has circled the globe and has embraced all the non-communist countries of Europe, Asia, and Africa." I would suggest that this foreign policy realism, which I'm sure there are those here who subscribe to it, and which enabled him to argue that containment should be applied only to core areas of U.S. interest and led him to be correct, for example, on his opposition to the Vietnam War, did leave him out of step when it came to the making of U.S. foreign policy. And I think this was discussed in the last panel with respect to this issue of values and interests. U.S. foreign policy, to be successful, does require an appeal, given the nature of the United States, to both values and interests, to be successful politically in the domestic concept. His definition of the national interest as a realist was quite narrow. He was very consistent on this, from his horror at NSC 68 in the 50s to the opposition to NATO enlargement in the 1990s. In my view, there's no more important foreign policy issue for us to debate than how expansive we view the national interest. And wherever we come down on it, we always have to grapple with Kennan. And I think this is one of the key legacies of his time in government and his writings. Now, the previous panel was from former directors of policy planning, all very successful, but all, always working in the shadow of George Kennan. He was the first director and had, in fact, proposed the office, and everyone gets measured against that standard. But he also gets, but also any aspiring strategist also gets measured against George Kennan. It was, as I said earlier, true during the Cold War. It was very true and interestingly true at the end of the Cold War. Once containment was over, the question was what would come next. And there were some very interesting debates in the government in the early 1990s about precisely on this point. In 1993, for example, National Security Advisor Anthony Lake was eager to articulate what America's new grand strategy would be. And the internal deliberations within the White House to come up with the new idea that would replace containment, this debate or this discussion was known as the Kennan sweepstakes. You wanted to be known as the person who came up with the new idea that would be the successor to containment. And the goal was to come up with a one-word replacement. Because that would be easy for people to understand. And so the word they came up with was enlargement. And you probably don't remember that. Nobody does. And I think it lasted for about 2 weeks. And the idea was, and it was actually, it had a certain, there was a logic to it. The idea was, okay, if the goal during the Cold War was to contain communism, now that communist regimes had collapsed, the United States should focus on enlarging the community of democracies. When members of Lake's team went up to the Hill to gain support from members of Congress, they had an enthusiastic response from Congressman Newt Gingrich. And the pitch they made to Gingrich was, if during the, remember the maps in the Cold War, the red blob and the blue blob, now that the red blob had shrunk, the United States could expand the blue blob. And Gingrich thought this was absolutely brilliant. Like I said, of course, it didn't work. And so at the State Department in 1994, they brought the 90-year-old George Kennan for a conversation to get his advice. How do we do this? How do we come up with the one-word summation of American foreign policy that you did back in 1946, 1947? And Kennan's answer was, the world is far too complex for that today, and my advice would be to come up with a thoughtful paragraph or two. In 2018, we're still searching for the thoughtful paragraph or two. Thank you.
Thank you. So for the next sentence in the thoughtful paragraph of this panel, we'll turn to Chris Miller.
I'll have a couple of thoughtful paragraphs, I think, but hopefully not too long-winded. I like Jim. I'm intrigued by Kennan as a pessimist and the contrast between the pessimism of Kennan and the optimism of today's conversation. I found particularly optimistic the last panel, I thought, for very intelligent, capable diplomats, and I found myself thinking, if only we could have people like this in charge and have all of Congress and all of the media pushed off to the side and have the experts in control, which is a very Kennanite thing to say, wanting the experts in control. And as Jim mentioned, he had a strain of elitist thinking if only we had a type of government where the experts were always in control, where you always had people with the right training and the right experience managing foreign policy, how much easier everything would be, how many fewer unforced errors we would make, how our relations with other countries become so much simpler as a result. And it's easy to see why a citizen like Kennan or anyone else could fall into the trap of thinking that way. But what I'd like to suggest is that idea is wrong. And the reason I know it's wrong is because Kennan, the diplomatic historian, prove that it's wrong so eloquently and so many times. So to prepare for our conversation today, I reread several of Kennan's books on the rise of the Franco-Russian alliance in the late 19th century, which he wrote after leaving government service. And Kennan believed that this alliance was the root cause, at the end of the day, of World War I. That if you hadn't had the Franco-Russian alliance, you wouldn't have had the interlocking alliance system, which ultimately led Europe to divide into two camps and fall into war in 1914. And it's interesting, his analysis as to why this alliance came about. On the one hand, there are obvious structural factors. There was a conflict between Russia and Germany, conflict between Russia and France. Enemy, my enemy is my friend. That logic is pretty straightforward. But Kennan was also very keen to analyze the domestic factors, both in France and in Russia, that were pushing towards an alliance. And it's worth noting that Russia at a time was a monarchy, was an autocracy, was a place with no free press at all, and yet nonetheless, Kennan was very keen to point out that, in fact, public opinion in Russia in the 1870s and 1880s was a profoundly important factor in shaping foreign policy. And of course, this conflicts with everything Kennan has said about the significance or the wisdom of democracy as a type of government, or of the Americans who elected governments that he so frequently found distasteful. There's just a numerous number of quotes of Kennan about democracy. Just I pulled a couple just to give you a taste. This is one of my favorites. Democracy is one of those prehistoric monsters with a body as long as this room and a brain the size of a pin. And if you go through his diaries, there are just innumerable examples of this skepticism about popular government. But what you find from Kennan, the diplomatic historian, is that whether you like it or not, public opinion has an enduring force in shaping foreign policies in almost any country. The United States is not unique in this regard. The same was true of France in the 19th century, and the same was true of Russia in the 19th century. So I thought I would pull just one anecdote from the rise of the Franco-Russian alliance that Kennan devoted almost a half a chapter to, which, when you zoom out in historical terms, wasn't that important, but I think is an interesting illustration as to what effect does public opinion have on countries' foreign policy. So if you put yourself in France, in Paris, France, in 1890, so this is before the French and the Russians have fully signed any sort of deals that are committing themselves to go to war in 1914, but already there's been an improvement in relation between the two countries. You had the collapse of the Three Emperors League that brought together Germany, Austro-Hungary, and Russia, which made possible Russia's opening to France. You had growing tension in the Balkans, where Russia was clashing with Germany over who should rule Bulgaria and how should Serbia be governed, these Balkan disputes that would eventually lead to World War I. So there were many reasons why you might think that France and Russia would be getting along better. But the French had a political problem on their hands, and it actually, the roots of this problem are actually not in Russia or the Balkans or Bulgaria or Serbia, but in Panama, because the French had funded an attempt to build a canal through Panama, which went very badly. It was very expensive. It went bankrupt in 1889, and it involved most of the French elite at the time were invested or in some ways involved in this canal building project. And so the canal goes bankrupt, and in the investigation into the bankruptcy, it's discovered that the entire French elite have been either bribed or illegally invested into this scheme. But more than that, that many of the payments from the canal scheme that were routed through the French Prime Minister's office were being used to buy favorable press coverage in Russia. So the French were buying favorable press coverage in a country where the censor controlled the press. So think about that. So in some ways, this is the first version of the Panama Papers 19th century edition, and it's being used to purchase fake news in Russia. And in fact, the news that the French were buying was of an editor named Mikhail Katkov, who was one of the most influential pan-Slavist editors in Russia. The French wanted to support his publication, Moskovsky Vedomosti, because he was advocating bending the alliance with Germany and moving towards the French instead. And so Kennan traces the importance of this incident. He says it was involving the entire French elite. The Tsar was following very closely the goings-on of the French Panamanian Company, not because anyone thought the French Panamanian Company was important. It wasn't, but because everyone knew that the effects on public opinion in Paris and in Russia would shape the fate of the alliance. And so Kennan concludes his assessment of this incident of the Panama Papers 1.0, arguing that into such bewilderments, he writes, statesmen can easily wander, And indeed, you see throughout his whole career, a statesman who understands so deeply the causes of the problems and relations between the United States and Russia, the United States and the Soviet Union, struggling so greatly to navigate domestic politics and public opinion in the United States and also in the Soviet Union, when he was the ambassador. So I think this is an interesting lens in which to think about Kennan the elitist and Kennan the skeptic of public engagement and diplomacy, Kennan the skeptic of a democratic public making decisions about foreign policy, and the realities that Kennan the historian discovered, which was that public opinion is always, whether you like it or not, a crucial factor in shaping the options that are available to decision makers like him.
Thank you so much, Chris. And now we turn to Grace Kenan Markey for some concluding prepared remarks, and then after which we'll open the floor to discussion.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank the Kennan Institute and Matt Rajansky for putting on this conference. As a Kennan, it has been an extraordinary experience to just sit here and listen for all these different remarks about my father, and I know my sister Joan appreciates it too. And I think we're all honored and touched. Before I start on my few remarks, I might as well, and Anna Marie Slaughter's talk reminded me of this. My father, while he very much enjoyed the company of women, did not think of them as being leaders or political thinkers or in any way playing a role in the government, or in the power system of a country. When he went into the State Department, there were no women except secretaries, and he always thought, when he heard of a successful woman, he would say, "Imagine that, and she's a woman." So I think he would be a little surprised to see me up here. But when he died in 2005, my siblings and I all grieved at our personal loss. But we also thought that our father's ideas and influence would be waning as well. It has been a complete surprise that not a week goes by without our reading or hearing some reference to Kennan and his policies. Most, of course, refer to the containment policy, but for us, it also keeps our father alive. The question of the day is whether George Kennan is still relevant today, 3 days before the 114th anniversary of his birth. In some cases, definitely not. He certainly never understood or learned to use the new technology which has transformed the world. He was definitely European-focused, but some of that was probably because his diplomatic posts were all in Europe and he married a Norwegian. He had peculiar prejudices. He had no interest in South America and a strong prejudice against the state of California. But he was interested in China and the Far East and played an active role in the State Department's stance on Korea at the beginning of that conflict. My father was definitely an elitist, but in the better sense of the word. He felt very strongly about the importance of knowledge. He considered the more you know about a country, the more sensitive you can be towards it. He was a strong supporter of the importance of professional diplomats with foreign language skills and in-depth country erudition. In terms of what is happening in the State Department today, staff cuts, resignation of senior officials, empty ambassadorial posts, he would be appalled. I can hear him fulminating at the breakfast table. George Kennan was committed to competence and dedicated to professionalism. While he never understood the internet, he kept an enormous card file, which took up half a wall of his office and was almost a precursor of the computer. He tracked Russian military and politically important figures by reading the Russian press. That knowledge often led him to learning of twists in Soviet foreign policy before it happened. When he was ambassador to Moscow, many of the other foreign ambassadors would come to the American embassy. Of course, ambassadors go in a car with the flag flying, so it was very obvious when an ambassador's car went in. when the foreign ambassadors came to learn what was going on and report it back to their governments. My father thought that Stalin's irritation with his knowledge was one of the reasons that he was declared persona non grata in 1952. 22 years later, in 1974, I went to the Soviet Union as Senator Kennedy's aide and interpreter, Ted Kennedy's aide and interpreter, and we had a meeting with Secretary General Brezhnev in his Kremlin office. At the beginning of the meeting, Brezhnev's top aide pulled me aside and told me privately that he wanted me to know how much they all admired George Kennan. This was 20 plus years after he'd been kicked out of Moscow. My father's emphasis on professionalism was also reflected in his deep involvement with the Kennan Institute, where we find ourselves. He was very proud to have played a role in creating this institution dedicated to supporting advanced Russian studies, and he would be thrilled to know about the conference today. Today, when the relations with Russia are again strained, the question is, do we go back to a containment policy? I think maybe, as points been made so well earlier today, in a multipolar world, the containment policy, as he saw it, although he always saw it as more political than military, but I think it no longer applies. But I think some of the reasons he formulated this policy still exist. He had a horror of nuclear war. He had traveled around Europe at the end of World War II and never got over the loss of human life and physical destruction caused by that conflict. He later co-sponsored the so-called Gang of Four Declaration, along with McGeorge Bundy, Robert McNamara, and Gerard Smith, that called on Washington to renounce first use of nuclear weapons. His containment policy was also predicated on his gut feeling that the Soviet Union was in some way unnatural and therefore temporary. Ambassador Byerly told us last night that when asked by the Kennan why the Kennan Institute was named the Institute for Advanced Russian Studies, he answered, because the Soviet Union will not last, but Russia will. I think the best aspect of what we will retain from George Kennan's thinking is that we have the luxury of choosing the best of his ideas. It's amazing how many of those policies are perhaps even more applicable today than when they were first formulated. He was a very prescient man. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists. We'll open the floor in just a moment. I wanted to follow up on one thread that seems to run through a number of the presentations, and this is about technology. Maybe not quite in the sense that you meant it, David, although I think that the environmental aspect is intriguing and much under-discussed in analyses and conversations about Canon. But I wanted to ask you, just to evaluate those who wish to comment on the point, in a way, how much technology separates us from the world of Kennan. That sort of, Chris, when you mentioned public opinion, of course, the 1890s, you use the term fake news. It sounds sort of vaguely similar to the present, but in a number of ways has to be quite different. Kennan's mode of communication was sort of the equivalent of slow food. I mean, it was thoughtful, meditative, long form. And it wouldn't have lent itself, obviously, to Twitter and sort of many contemporary media of communication. So whether it's about communicating ideas or whether it's about the nature of interstate interaction or non-state actors, does technology separate us, sort of organically from Kennan, or is it a kind of shift that puts us in a somewhat different situation, but not that far from the world of Kennan? I don't know if anyone wants to jump in on the technology question.
I mean, definitely, it's hard to envision your dad tweeting, isn't it? I think he would be a conscientious objector when it comes to that. But I think about this a lot, right? And it seems to me that so far, even if you look at the debate that's happening inside the United States today about what role we should play in the world going forward, it falls pretty clearly actually within the cycles of American history that we've had. It's not that technology and our ability to have both access to new information and a whole different set of tools for influencing the world, it hasn't fundamentally changed the contours of the debate, which are quite similar, even down to the appropriation of the terminology of the 1930s or the replication of many of the debates that we've had at many points in our history as far as how inward-looking we should be versus outward-looking. I think the same is true for Russia. President Putin, I think, would reject the notion of containment, would reject the notion that he is recreating the Soviet Union, perhaps in some ways, but he, while expressing nostalgia for the Soviet Union, he and I think those around him have really sought to, I think to the extent they have had an ideology underpinning their return to the world stage in the last few years, it's been much more to harken back to 19th century Russian foreign policy and the notion of Russia as a great power in a world of multipolar great power politics, as opposed to the zero-sum politics of the Soviet Union. Again, so to me, that feels like it's not the radical disjuncture that sometimes we think about in our either techno-utopias or dystopias, as the case may be. And so, I feel like there's no question that there are tools to influence real world events now that didn't exist just a few years ago and that are playing a role in foreign policy. I mean, remember in 2016, I know that seems like an epic ago, when people said like, oh, gee, can you imagine a tweet making having a consequence in actual foreign policy? I think we can now say after a year of this that actually it does. And so I don't want to be, sanguine about that. I think it's very clear that the speeded up pace of communications, the processing or lack of processing of information, the and its effect on what we're going to do are substantially different than the environment that obviously existed in the immediate aftermath of World War II. And yet I see the through line there, and my guess is that George Kennan would have seen the through line there as well.
Yeah, I guess this isn't just about technology, but it strikes me that changes of the media landscape from Kennan's time to ours were not all technologically driven. That there was a club of international correspondence. It was a club of which Kennan was a member. That was quite restrictive about what sorts of things got covered and were not covered, and whether we want to call it the democratization of news or the vulgarization of news, that is something that has been greatly aided by technology, but not created by it. And so, to me, that moment came home most clearly when reading the memoirs of Arthur Kroc, who was a New York Times columnist, journalist in the 50s, and included as an appendix a lesser version, shall we say, of the Kennan's works, the Clifford Elsie report, which was a highly classified White House analysis of the Soviet threat that appeared in 1949, that was declassified only in Kroc's memoir, right? Not through sort of regular channels, right? There was a kind of very clubby atmosphere that left lots of things unsaid. And it speaks to a kind of reorganization of an American elite, again, which Kennan was very much a part. That isn't just about tweeting. Granted, tweeting, cable news, and so on have all contributed to that handily, but the changed media landscape, I think we're making a mistake to reduce it to technological change.
I want to make a comment. It's slightly different, but I just it's really sparked by Grace's point about knowledge and sort of where we get our knowledge, and in academia, in the university landscape, there's a reason why the great universities were the great research universities. And that's because they were the universities that had the great libraries. If you wanted to be a great research scholar back in the day, you had to be at a university with a great library, like a Princeton or a Harvard. And that has, one great positive change from technology is you can be anywhere and have access to the same kind of information as a scholar at Harvard with Widener Library. The thing that really troubles me about all of us who now have that opportunity, right? I'm an American university and I have that same opportunity. I do think our knowledge is has been diminished by the way we go about reading. Because the one thing that libraries provided, as did reading print newspapers, was the opportunity when you did a search for information to come across all sorts of other things that you wouldn't have necessarily come across. You would go in the stacks, you'd be looking for a book, and then you'd see the book like down, and you'd start looking down the shelf, and you'd see all sorts of things you wouldn't have seen otherwise. And I don't know about you, I find this, and I read my New York Times and my Washington Post online. So what do? I go to the World section, I go to the top story section, I go to the opinion section. I miss all the stories I used to read when I read those papers in print, and I think that has, at least for me, I'm diminished because of it. Now, it's also the case on the other hand that people will tweet articles out from all sorts of places that I never would have seen before. But I do think the way we go about procuring our knowledge is, while it's much more open to much more people, I think there are also ways in which we're diminished by the way we get that information.
There's a detail in the Gaddis biography that apparently when George Kennan was policy planning director, he would go occasionally to a carrel in the Library of Congress to write his memos. And I suspect that in the present day, it would just be impossible to be away from email and communications to do that kind of a thing. So even in government, what you're describing as, sort of the curtailing of serious reading is almost a self-imposed dynamic. Ambassador Byerly, I saw a hand up a little bit earlier.
Thank you. Thanks to the panel for sort of playing against type of a post-lunch panel. This conference has just gotten better and better and better. So I have just two observations briefly to make about things that I just heard, not really questions, and I'll be brief. The first picks up on Grace's very last words. Our father was a prescient man. And I know when Jim said that Kennan got NATO enlargement wrong, I know what he means because I too think that NATO enlargement was a wise policy and I support it. But I think we have to be, we talked about this a bit last night, we have to be intellectually disciplined when we talk about George Kennan and NATO enlargement. George Kennan was right when he foresaw that the enlargement of NATO would had the possibility to become the central animating grievance in the rationale the Russians have laid forth that explains their estrangement from the West. That's a very different question than whether or not the certainty of that grievance, of that estrangement, would be enough to abandon NATO enlargement as a project. And again, Jim, I know you agree with me, it would not. But that's a very different question as to whether George Kennan foresaw it in the right way. It's a question of description versus prescription, and that leads to the second comment, picking up on what Chris said, and I think Wayne Mary mentioned it again this morning. We talked about it a bit last night. Frankly, a lot of what George Kennan wrote, to include the long telegram and the X article, are today largely irrelevant because he's describing a world that really doesn't exist anymore. And he described it, he really didn't describe it, he was prescribing a set of measures and approaches that had their moment, and that moment is gone. What I think is, and I mentioned this last night as well, so obviously I'm very convinced of this, the enduring value for all of us who spend our lives trying to understand what's going on in Russia with its people, with its leaders. The enduring value of George Kennan is his historical work, and that's what Chris talked about, and bravo to you for pulling out that book. We talked about Mikhail Katkov last night, too, actually. So, as Wayne said this morning, and as you just kind of encouraged us all, implicitly at least, we can all do ourselves and our country a favor by going back and rereading George Kennan's histories of Russia, in which he describes a Russia that still exists without prescription in large part. The prescription at this point is up to us. But understanding the description that is still relevant and valid to this day, 150 years after the period he was describing in writing he did in the 1970s and 1980s, is truly remarkable. And that is why the legacy of George Kennan is something that we'll be studying for a long time.
Of course. Yeah, just thanks on the enlargement issue. Because it gives me an opportunity to say something that I have felt strongly about for a long time, and I think it might actually be something George Kennan would agree with, I would hope anyway. And your point on, even if one supported the policy of NATO enlargement, a recognition of how the Russians viewed their interest and how they viewed that policy is important. And it's something that I think, certainly in that particular case, and I think it's something the United States does more generally that I think would be great if we got rid of. The United States made a decision that's what it wanted to do and decided that that was in the United States' interest. I think one of the big mistakes was trying to tell the Russians that it was in their interest too. Basically, the message to the Russians in the mid-90s was, your real threats are to the south with Islamic extremism and to the east with the rise of China. This is great because you're going to have this stable Europe on your western border, and then you don't have to worry about it. So enlargement's great. And, my view of the way U.S. foreign policy should be conducted is we should, decide what our interests are. And we should listen to our interlocutors when they describe how they view their interests. And you could still end up coming out in the same place in terms of pursuing a policy that you wanted to pursue. But at least you would have you would have taken on board the way in which they describe their interests and think about ways either where you might have common interest or where you're going to compete or even come into conflict. And I think that's something that certainly since the end of the Cold War, was certainly true in the 90s, was really missing from a United States that felt it could do anything it wanted, and if others objected, too bad.
Please.
Wayne Mary, American Foreign Policy Council. I'd like to make a plug here for a book written by a Kennan Institute scholar that's coming out very soon about these issues. It's called No Place for Russia. It's an examination of European multilateralism, European security institutions in the 1990s. Written by William Hill, was Foreign Service officer, studied in Leningrad, served in Moscow with a number of us who were here. And it's an extraordinarily comprehensive work on this subject. I think it greatly informs many of the debates we have about NATO enlargement, but other aspects of Russia and the West during the 1990s. It should have been out 2 years ago. I've already footnoted it twice in things I've published, but it got delayed. It will not because of any fault of the text, but because the original publishing firm went out, sort of stopped publishing. But Columbia University Press is going to be bringing it out. I think it's on their April list, which he told me means it will be out in August. But the title of the book is No Place for Russia, William Hill. And it's a product of much of his time here at the Kennan Institute. And I think it is a volume that Ambassador Kennan himself would have valued, though I cannot say it's quite as well written as his works.
In the center.
A wonderful talk. In terms of the Stephen Shore, in terms of the democratization of the making of American foreign policy, I'm reminded David Halberstam wrote a book, The Best and the Brightest. Now, when Kennan opposed the war in Vietnam, this was a dissenting view, and I'm wondering, did that book in particular, was he aware of that book, and did it change his reflection on whether a foreign policy could be made by an elite, knowledgeable few in any way?
Why don't we take a couple of questions and then the panelists can sort of go down the line.
Yes, Carl Weichel from American University's Lifelong Learning Program. When the Soviet Union imploded in '89, America had this unexpected windfall where the Truman Doctrine collapsed. It no longer needed to fight Marxism and communism in Central America, Cuba, and Africa, and Southeast Asia. Thereafter, the terms were floating around peace dividend. Now, I don't know if this was just amongst the social arena or in parts of academia that I saw, but when you look at the George H. Bush administration followed by Bill Clinton's administration, was that term ever embraced as a proactive form of peace building that we've done in many other times? Thank you.
Okay, let's take one more and then we'll let the panelists speak. The center.
Hi, thank you very much. This is addressed to Grace Kenan Markey. We're focusing primarily on Russia, but I'm interested what your father had to say about the emerging countries of Africa. He certainly saw the decolonization. He saw the rise of independent countries. He saw what happened to South Africa. Did he ever talk about this? Did he have particular favorites that were emerging? Did he ever talk about Nelson Mandela? This is a blank slate, and I wonder if you can at least shed some light on that.
Okay, so we've got Best and the Brightest. If that book is known to have influenced Kennan, then the notion of the peace dividend. And then thirdly, the question for Grace about decolonization and Africa.
Well, I think if Halberstam's book appeared in 1971, is that right? So Kennan would have been prescient indeed if that book had influenced him in his 1965 opposition to the Vietnam War.
Any thoughts on the peace dividend?
Yeah, in December of 1992, after Clinton's election, before he took office, he was in a conversation with Lee Hamilton, who was then chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and later the head of this Wilson Center. And he said to Lee Hamilton, you know, I'm not going to have to do foreign policy. And Lee Hamilton said, you're the president, you're going to be president of the United States, of course you're going to have to do foreign policy. And it was like, I think I got one question on foreign policy from one journalist during the campaign. I'm not going to be doing foreign policy. And by the way, 1993 was not a great year of American foreign policy. But the one issue he cared the most about, and which, you know, they really spent a lot of time thinking about it from the get-go, was assistance to Russia. And providing, you know, several months in, you know, there was a major assistance package that had put together the United States, some of its major allies, and the international financial institutions. And the reason was precisely to enable there to be a peace dividend, because for Clinton, the main focus was his domestic programs. And what he most needed in order to fund the domestic programs was a shift away from defense dollars to the domestic programs. And so the thinking was, if we can support Russia's transformation, and it's no longer an enemy that requires our defense dollars, I can get what I need to fund the things that I really care about. And so, you know, I think there was certainly a sense that there was this link between the way Russia would turn out and would, you know, hopefully continue on the transition post-collapse, and the ability to support domestic political programs that were important to a democratic president.
So, Grace, I think we know the answer when it comes to Latin America, but what about Africa and decolonization more generally? And how
well, Africa's a little bit in the same position as Latin America with my father. He did go visit South Africa. He was appalled by the problems, you know, of apartheid, but he didn't have any solution for it that I remember. But he wasn't very interested in the emerging countries of Africa. He really wasn't. He was interested in Russia. He was interested in the Far East. He was interested, but not really in Africa. So I'm afraid I don't have any positive answer there. But I worked in the NGO movement all over, mostly in Russia or in and out of Russia, and later Ukraine for 25 years. I spent a lot of time in the people movement, as Anne-Marie Slaughter called it. And yes, the word peace dividend was definitely used. Thank you.
So here in the center with the striped shirt. And then there's a hand in the back. Oh, and
Hi, my name is Franny Goffnet. This is a question in response to Ms. Warnecki's quoting her father as saying that the USSR won't last, but Russia will. What do you think he would say to mostly young Ukrainians now who see the USSR as just impossible to get rid of? And I'm not talking about the monuments or the architecture. I'm talking about the mark on the culture, the systems of bribes, the pressure, where people really feel like they still have to hide. And I'm thinking a lot about bribes also.
so right behind you, and then there's a question in the very back.
Hi, my name is Dimitri. Thank you very much, especially Mrs. Warnecke. That was very touching. Thank you. I have two questions. First one to Mrs. Warnecke. I wonder if there's some part of Russian culture that your father brought home. I heard the part about wanting to write a biography about Chekhov. Maybe he ate a lot of sour cream, or what kind of Russian culture did you see in your home? And the second part is about the question of democracy and Russia versus stability. I know when Stalin found out that Churchill was voted out of office, he was shocked completely, and now most Russian people I talk to are completely shocked, even more than we are, that President Trump is elected. But we here obviously value democracy more than stability, case in point what's going on now. But a lot in Russia, I'm just wondering, I haven't read much Kennan, I've read some, and I've enjoyed it very much, but I'm wondering what he thought about this concept of the ability of Russian people for democratic government, and what his views were on Russia's ability to be a democratic country. Thank you.
So let's take one more question in the very back.
Hi, Avis Bolin. Kennan believed that the Soviet Union would collapse of its own weight, in part because it was overextended. And his observation on that was very much influenced by Gibbon's observation about the overextension of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. And I think that you can say he was right on that point. Gibbon was right on that point. What does members of the panel think that he would say about the United States in the world today on that point?
All right, so we have 4 questions just to recap. Persistence of at least cultural or sort of political economic mentality structures from the USSR in the post-Soviet world, Russian culture, the sour cream question, about democracy and stability. That's the 3rd question, and that sort of leads to the 4th about stability, democracy as applied not to the Soviet Union or to Russia, but to the United States. Please.
Well, I know we all want to hear, and I do too, Grace's answer, especially on the sour cream question. But just quickly, I thought those were excellent questions that in many ways kind of tie together what the panel's been about, both the persistence of the Soviet influence in Ukraine and what's the through line from corruption or bribe taking to these bigger picture questions around Russian society and culture, and whether it is somehow has a different historical narrative when it comes to the trade-offs between democracy and stability. And I'll try to tie that together a little bit. When I moved to Russia, it was basically at the very beginning of Vladimir Putin's tenure as a foreign correspondent, and sort of at the end of this period of the 1990s that we're talking about, where I think it's fair to say, from the vantage point we're looking at right now, we were quite naive, and in many ways you could argue we really forgot both the history and the diplomatic lessons that Kennan would have told us. I think we didn't pay attention to them, and there was a real the end of history view had persisted in Washington, and even though the attacks of September 11th occurred really in the first year both of our living in Russia and also really of Putin's presidency, and that made it apparent that history was roaring back in some way, but basically I think what made Kennan's work so resonant for us as new correspondents coming to this Russia is that it was actually a more helpful guide, even then, I would argue, to the culture and the place that we were seeing, both in Russia itself as well as the countries of the former Soviet Union. My husband and I, we traveled to 14 of the 15. We did not make it to Turkmenistan, but we did spend a lot of time in Ukraine as well, including through the first Orange Revolution. And what I would say is, we went around and got a lot of advice from people when we were going to move there as correspondents. And in addition to the enduring power and necessity to really spend a lot of time on the language as a gateway and an access to the culture, which I believe it to be, we went and met with David Remnick, and he said, I said, what books should we read? And he said, read Chekhov. And I said, okay, well, that's great. I promise we'll do that. But what books should we read? And he said, no, read Chekhov. And, again, that's where I would say to you that that's not just a Soviet legacy, but it's a Russian legacy. Poor governance in Russia didn't start with the Soviet Union. In fact, there would have been no Soviet Union had there not been corruption, abuse of power, and a fundamental disconnect between the society itself and that of its rulers. A disconnect which ironically probably shaped and informed many of the ways in which the Bolsheviks themselves thought about constructing their state. I think that was very much in a dialogue to the Tsarist Russia that they had seen before them. So at any rate, my view is that Kennan, the historian, still has a lot of relevance to us and is not a point of disjuncture. But, we saw in the Russia that we experienced of the beginning of the Putin years a lot that resonated with today. And again, just to go back to Ukraine, I think that certainly as a writer, and I would argue probably in terms of the history that is available to us, that's an interesting question and critique around Kennan's work. I felt when we came back from Russia that really writing about the toxic power of a society that was filled with corruption at every level, from the everyday nature up to the very integration between the state itself and the corruption, that was our biggest weakness as correspondents. It's a very hard thing to do. It defies many of the norms of journalism as we practice it, right? And that's the one thing we really wanted to come back and communicate to people that we had a hard time writing about. And I think it's a fair point to say that's why Remnick said read Chekhov, because that's probably true about much of our official history of this part of the world as well.
Could I follow up on the ramifications of that for U.S. policy? Because it seems like Kennan quote about Russia persisting after the Soviet Union is, I think, more clever than we at first realized, because the U.S. presumption was that after the Soviet Union there would be a Western society.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
We could just presume that it would work like Copenhagen works or like Madrid works. And I think over time we've come to realize that Russia persisting after the Soviet Union means something different than Russia will be like Copenhagen or Madrid. Mm-hmm. In the past couple of years, there's been a realization process on the behalf of U.S. policymakers and the U.S. public overall that, in fact, the differences are more profound than we at first presumed, and that we couldn't just assume that they will naturally come to think like us because the communists are no longer in charge.
I just want to jump in. The reason I'm jumping in is, one thing I've learned over all my years in academia is there are certain people that you're paired up with that you don't want to follow. I am not following Grace. So she should definitely get the last word on this panel. With respect to, if you were to ask the question, by the way, what book should you read, I would point you to Susan and Peter's book, Kremlin Rising, on the early Putin period. It's still a great book to read to really think about that period. I want to, Avis, the question, the overextension issue. Because I think we heard, for those of you who are here in the second panel, a very interesting point by Jake Sullivan that reminded me of a speech that Hillary Clinton gave early in the time that she was Secretary of State. I think it was at the Council on Foreign Relations. I forget where it was, but she said something to the effect, the point she was trying to make was not the point I took away. The point she was trying to make was, people talk about, ugly America and, America should pull back. But the point she was making was, wherever I go, people want the people I meet with want more of America, right? And Jake was putting it in the context of trying to, as a policy planning director, lay out what he described as 4 or 5 priorities, and how hard that was, because if you say these are our 4 or 5 priorities, everybody wants to ask, well, what are you going to do about this country? What are you going to do about that region? And pretty soon, you have to have an answer for every country and every region. And I think for the United States, to be successful, just because other places may want something from us, I mean, it goes back to the point I made earlier about the interest, our interest in listening to their interest. That doesn't mean we have to do it. That doesn't mean we have to respond. Doesn't mean we have to spend money there. Doesn't mean we have to send troops there. And I think our reaction typically is, oh my gosh, they really want us there, so we should be there. And we can't afford it.
So, David, why don't you jump in, and then we'll have all the panelists other than Grace offer closing comments so that we can heed Jim's advice and give Grace the final word and the answer that we're all awaiting to the sour cream question.
Well, I'll go with my first closing comment then, which is I think the question of overextension speaks to a number of different issues about Kennan's thought. He thought the U.S. was overextended for much of the Cold War, in part because of the commitments that they made, that the U.S. made in the decolonizing world. And it should be said that his opposition, for instance, to Vietnam, American intervention in Vietnam, had a lot to do with, I think, an astute perception that there was no way that the U.S. could support a viable, publicly supported regime. But it also, I think, you can read in this a kind of nagging doubt that the Vietnamese people on their own would be able to construct a stable democracy, right? This speaks a little, I think you alluded in perhaps more gentle terms to this. So the idea that Kennan would think the U.S. overextended was a very familiar one to him, because by the early 1960s, this is what he was saying in public venues, and that was in a more, I would say, shall we say, contained version of America's kind of global vision than we see right now.
Susan, would you like to for some closing thoughts?
First of all, this has been a real honor and so helpful for me just to be able to listen to all of this, including going back to the history of fake news. I'm sure some of my colleagues will be interested in that. I just want to say when I tweeted out before I came that the Wilson Center's announcement of this conference, I said, I'm looking forward to this. It was very interesting to see the response, and basically a lot of people retweeted this and they said, well, number one, we sure need a Kennan for our times, and number two, but there isn't one. So at any rate, maybe it's a welcome break for these few hours at least from the challenges that await us when we go back outside or look back on Twitter. So thank you.
Chris?
Well, I'm primarily interested in the sour cream question, so why don't we get to that?
I feel the same way.
Right. Grace, the floor is yours.
Now, did he bring sour cream into our lives? Well, first of all, my father didn't exactly bring Russia. He did bring it home, and I'll tell you in what forms, but I also lived there as a child, and so my memory is not of him bringing Russia to me, but of being in Russia. And I did go to a Soviet school in the, what would have been the 7th grade, a regular Soviet school. I was the only foreigner. School number 131 in Moscow. And so my main memory for that, though, is when they taught us about the wonderful, wonderful Spartans and the terrible, corrupt Athenians. I came home and told my father about this. I said, Daddy, you have to understand. And he was so shocked that he began giving me alternate history lessons at home. So I thought it was very odd to go to school and be taught one thing and then come home and be taught something else. I found it a bit confusing. But when he did bring Russia home, I think our main memory is he was a wonderful musician. He played the guitar and he sang Russian songs, and those songs are still, wafting through my head. He also loved Russian literature. He did want to write a book on Chekhov, but he would read Chekhov, Tolstoy, Pushkin, Turgenev. So all these people, Russian culture was very much in our house. Not so much Russian food. He was not really a foodie. I don't think he ever thought we were bringing democracy to Russia, or that he thought of Russia more in the traditional Russian sense. Now, there were 3 questions, and I'm not sure I remember the first question correctly. The second question about did I feel the Soviet influence in Ukraine? I didn't so much when I was there. I was there from 1999 to 2003, and it was a time of great hope, and when Ukraine was moving forward, and people were very nationalistic, very proud of their independence and free. They were not anti-Russian, but they were just very happy to have their own country. And so I didn't feel people weren't really talking about the Soviet influence in that way. Now, what was that very first question? Because I feel I haven't done justice to it. Was it?
Well, there was a question about, I think that you just addressed now, about sort of lingering on of the USSR and then issues of democracy and stability.
Well, then I guess I have. And so it was so interesting to listen to everybody else, and I think this has been a truly useful and wonderful panel, and I'm honored to be a part of it.
And now, Matt is going to say a few words in closing of the conference.
Yes. Well, there's nothing by way of a formal closing. My sense from all 3 of these incredibly wide-ranging, really fascinating, and utterly self-servingly, I'll say, blue ribbon discussions today on a topic that's very much near and dear to my heart and my professional interests in this institution and this time is that there are not necessarily definitive period at the end of the sentence answers to questions whether they're about sour cream or NATO enlargement. But every one of them is worth asking, and they're especially worth asking if you share, as I think every single person in this room and on these panels does, in the belief that ideas actually should matter and in fact do matter in American policy, and that's why we're all sitting here, not only in the Wilson Center, but in Washington, D.C., and not merely in a university somewhere else in the country. This is a worthwhile exercise not only for a conference like this, but for the book that Michael and I have sort of hinted at will come out of this. So I hope all of you will join us back again, I don't know, half a year, 9 months from now, depending on how much leverage we can exert, reference back to our policy planning panel, on our prospective authors. All of this is a credit to our wonderful speakers, to Michael Kimmage, who's been the intellectual godfather of this whole day, to our sponsors, the Nadav Foundation, Diana Davis Spencer, who's here with us still. And I want to add one more note of thanks, since you haven't heard it all day, to the Kennan team, who have silently and skillfully made all of this happen in the background. Joe, Isabella, Morgan, Gemily, Elle, John, Nikolai, Will, and Madison. Thank you all.